Thank you for joining us today for the ABA Civil Rights and Social Justice Chair Chat. My name is Maleaha Brown. I'm chair of the ABA Commission on Domestic and Sexual Violence and an associate professor at the University of Houston Law Center. I'm thrilled to welcome you to this conversation. These chats are a unique opportunity to engage directly with the key issues at the heart of our work in civil rights and social justice, explore the perspectives of expert panelists, and spark discussions that inspire action. I'm especially honored to host this October Chair Chat in recognition of Domestic Violence Awareness Month. Today's topic, coerced debt and economic abuse, is more critical than ever. As we confront the issue of domestic violence, we know that it can show up in many ways and not just in the form of physical abuse. One of the more pervasive forms of domestic violence that has evolved in the modern era is economic abuse, which involves gaining and maintaining power and control over an intimate partner's financial resources. Economic abuse is particularly insidious because survivors of domestic violence often suffer detrimental long-term effects from economic abuse. So it's essential to examine how economic abuse intersects with the principles of justice and equity that guide the work of the ABA. I'm honored to be in conversation with Carla Sánchez-Adams today, who's a leader at the forefront of this work. She's a senior attorney at the National Consumer Law Center, where she focuses on emerging issues in banking and payment systems, fintech, and high-cost lending. Carla also serves with me on the ABA Commission on Domestic and Sexual Violence, and I've also had the distinct pleasure of working with her earlier in our careers. We both started our careers at Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid, so I've personally been able to see firsthand how Carla's powerful advocacy has helped survivors rebuild their economic futures. So thank you, Carla, for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me.
So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into our topic for today, which is economic abuse, specifically coerced debt. And I want to start off, Carla, with maybe just introducing you to everybody so everybody can kind of get a sense of why you got into this work. So can you share with us what drew you to this line of work?
Sure. So I was raised in the Tex-Mex border, and I grew up on the Mexican side, Matamoros, and was exposed to poverty at a young age. I was fortunate enough to be born into a family that had means, but there were so many without. So I, from a young age, knew that I wanted to give back to my community and wanted to be a voice to those that didn't have a voice. And I thought that meant doing international human rights. And then when I got to law school, discovered, well, there's no such thing as international human rights in the US. And the equivalent that I could find was poverty law. So I decided to be a legal aid attorney, and I wasn't quite sure which area of the law I was going to do because there's so many things that impact people who are impoverished. And while studying for the bar exam, in Texas, there's a section that you have to study for essays, and consumer law was one of those. And that was the first time I was exposed to these statutes that give people remedies, including money. And I said, well, that's great because people in poverty need money, so I would like to give them money. So I decided to pursue consumer law, but also being a part of legal aid, they recommend that you do something, an additional team that would put you in court. And so one of those practices was family. And I said, I can do this. And of course, we prioritized cases that had domestic violence, sexual assault. And so in practicing those cases, whether it was protective orders or custody orders or divorces, I realized there was a huge component of the abuse that was happening that had to do with finances, and that the family court was not able to remedy or to address. Even if they, in a divorce decree, for example, they said, okay, this party is responsible for this debt. If the debt was in the name of the victim, the DV victim or the DV survivor, then it didn't matter what the family court said because the creditor was still going to pursue the survivor. Similarly, if there was an order that this person should live in the home, if the home was in the name of the other person and the other person wasn't making payments, the same with the car, they would lose a car, they would lose a home. So I was like, well, this is important. Later collaboration with other organizations confirmed that studies have shown that economic insecurity is one reason that people who are in an abusive relationship return to that abusive relationship. So, if I want to tackle the root of, not reoccurring this cycle of DV and also poverty, then we need to tackle the resources and finances. And so I said, consumer law can do that. So I, kind of created this niche of helping survivors of DV, sexual assault, and human trafficking help achieve economic security through the use of consumer law.
That's so wonderful to hear. And just a little insight is that I was on the family law team at the legal aid when you were working there. And I found similar issues all the time. Even if you were able to get a judgment, you weren't really able to help your client get money from that judgment. And so even if they're able to get out of this abusive relationship, they still face many long-term effects after the relationship has ended. And it continues that domestic violence cycle. And so I think you just, really created your own, well, not your own niche, because there's a lot of people who do that, but I was really impressed with how you were using Texas laws at Trala to really help all of our clients. And then from there, you've moved into a policy space. Can you tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, so, in the work that I was doing at Legal Aid, there were already federal and state laws that existed to protect victims of identity theft. And so, we were talking about economic abuse, and before I get into the policy work, kind of just stepping back, you mentioned what economic abuse is, and part of it is depriving someone of resources that they already have, resources and assets. So that could include draining a 401k if somebody has a 401k, draining a bank account if there is money in the account, withholding, resources like a car, preventing someone from going to work, preventing someone from, going to school, or forcing someone to go to school and take out loans, forcing someone to go to work, and that that paycheck being redirected to another bank account the survivor doesn't have access to. It can include causing them to get fired from work because you're showing up and disturbing the work. But one area that is kind of an emerging area, if you will, encompasses what's called coerced debt, and that's defined as any non-consensual credit-related transaction, which is different from stealing resources and assets. This is creating a liability, so taking out credit that then a person is indebted to in the name of the survivor. And it encompasses these two different buckets, if you will, which is one, what would fit identity theft, so doing it through fraud. So the survivor doesn't know it's happening. The abuser has the survivor's information, right? If they cohabitate, if they live together, likely going to have access to a driver's license or social security, the address and the phone number, all of these things. And then the second bucket would be the coerced part of it, which is, yes, the survivor takes out debt, but only does it because of coercive control, this threat of violence, threat of negative impacts as a result of saying no. So that could be harm, physical, emotional, continued economic, psychological to the survivor themselves, or even to a child, a pet, the abuser themselves. So the person feels like they cannot say no. Right? So they say yes, they sign this credit-related transaction. And in most cases, almost every single client I had never actually had access to that money and or the product that was purchased by taking out that loan, right? So if it was a car, if it was clothes, if it was, a lot of times it was something for like the side hustle or the business of the abuser that the survivor didn't benefit from. So
Thank you.
sorry. That's a very long-winded way to say, how did I get into policies? Because these federal laws and state laws had protections for the ID theft bucket of coerced debt, right? For the victims who didn't know about it, but didn't actually have any protections for someone who was coerced into it. Clear protections, I should say. Sometimes you could make those arguments, but there wasn't anything clear. And so from my work at Trala, we, Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid, sorry for using a lot of acronyms. We were part of a coalition that started called the Texas Coalition on Coerced Debt. And one of the things that we decided to do was actually change the way identity theft was defined in Texas so that we could expand protections for identity theft victims to victims of coerced debt. And that led me to really enjoy the process and to want to do more of that, not just for Texas, but on the federal level. And, for all consumers and all, for all coerced debt victims.
No, thank you so much for level setting us there on what economic abuse is, because it really is wide ranging. So there's two questions that I'm getting from this, and I'll let you decide which one you want to take first. But one is I would want to know a little bit more about the history of economic abuse, because as you said, a lot of it has to do with credit fraud, when we're talking about coerced debt. And it makes me think that, even credit bureaus haven't been around for that long. And so economic abuse has definitely evolved within the years. And then my other question is on another track, is that it sounds like there's many people who are harmed, many different communities that are harmed by this type of abuse, not solely survivors of domestic violence. So I'll let you decide which one you want to take first, but those are the questions I'd like to hear from next.
Sure. So stepping back, economic abuse, sometimes people use the term financial abuse. Economic abuse is just the term that the Violence Against Women Act used. And it is a term that is pretty broad. So, but they're interchangeable. The reason I bring that up is because our financial system has greatly evolved since the 70s to now, right? So a lot of our consumer financial protection laws started in the 70s, our federal laws anyway. So like the Electronic Funds Transfer Act that has to do with money and bank account protections. And that started because people like debit cards started happening. And then there was a Truth in Lending Act and credit card provisions because credit cards became a thing. And then the Fair Credit Reporting Act started because credit bureaus became a thing, to your point, or, they're called consumer reporting agencies, but there were these bureaus that started getting your information and selling it to others for the purposes of determining whether or not you were creditworthy. So whether they would extend you a loan and other things. And so it started off like before we would interact with banks in person and the community knew you and they were community banks. And as our financial system evolved, then, our laws evolved and our interaction with our financial systems evolved. It became easier to abuse those systems because now, as many of you know, you can get a loan online without ever actually meeting anybody in person. There's a lot of, synthetic identity theft where you can just create an identity and fake accounts. But all of that coupled with women's rights and women's ability to, domestic violence does span more than just females. The vast majority of my clients were females, and females did not have the right to have a bank account, take out credit, do any of that on their own without a husband or a father before the 60s. So you had kind of these simultaneous things happening, right? The expansion of our financial system and also women being able to acquire resources, acquire property, have bank accounts, have credit accounts. So as that evolved, as our systems have evolved, it has made it easier. I love what Professor Angie Litwin, who coined the term coerced debt, said that our American credit system has become an unwilling partner to domestic violence, right, and to economic abuse, because it has enabled abusers to use the system in order to accumulate debt, and in the name of a survivor who really otherwise wouldn't have accumulated that debt. And in some ways, as we all know, debt is bondage. If you can't pay it, and you're quote unquote slave to debt, it's very hard for you to get out of poverty, to improve your situation, and to leave abusive relationships. So that's kind of the first part of your question. The second on how broad it is and who it impacts. So we use a lot of terms, and forgive us for the terms that we use. We use term domestic violence, sexual assault, gender-based violence, interpersonal violence, domestic abuse. But it all kind of, gender-based is an all-encompassing term for anything that has to do with gender-based violence, which includes sexual assault, how dating violence, things like that. But there's also a broader scope of abuse that happens outside of gender, which can be for older Americans. There's like abuse, VAWA defines it as abuse in later life. So when you have this dynamic of someone has control and power over another person, and that is often found in clients that have dementia or lack capacity. It's also true with foster youth, whether it's their biological parent or a foster or adoptive parent that is using that dynamic of power to take out debt in the name of that person. And you can also see it, trafficking cases. So it is pretty broad. It's, individuals that have disabilities, a caretaker might also do the same thing. So it's a lot of vulnerable populations where there is this this lack of parity in power of these relationships, where someone is able to use that in order to make, quote unquote, make them, or without them knowing, take out debt or deplete resources and things like that.
Yeah, two things come to mind there again. One is that when we create systems with good intentions, most of the time to help, a lot of times those systems end up playing a part in the abuse. It also makes me think about the court system and litigation abuse against survivors of domestic violence. We could have a whole nother chair chat on that topic as well. And then speaking to the vulnerable communities that are affected by economic abuse. I often find in conversations about domestic violence, a lot of people tend to tune out because they think none of my clients, I don't serve the domestic violence community, when really, I want to say the number is 1 in 7 women, or 1 in 9 women, 1 in 7 men. I might be butchering that,
Sure.
but 1 in 4 women.
Mhm.
Okay, thank you. 1 in 4 women are going to be in a domestic violence relationship at some point in their lives. And so even if they're not disclosing that to you, you likely are representing people who have experienced some form of abuse. And maybe it's not physical abuse, but perhaps it could be economic, or the many ways that domestic violence shows up. So
Yeah,
with
so
that,
some I mean, one thing, sorry to interrupt you, but the fascinating thing is the statistics is 1 in 4 women will have experienced some kind of violence in their life, and the number increases if they're a person of color. So that's
mm,
1 in 2. And kind of similarly, if the person comes from either the LGBTQIA community, if they're from, a disabled individual, like the, certain populations tend to experience these things more often, again, because of that dynamic of power and control and these systems, as you talked about, in place. But also, if you are someone who is, poverty, and if you're someone who is trapped in poverty, you are also likely to experience, like, there's that cyclical relationship of poverty and violence. What causes which, right? Like, does violence cause poverty? Poverty cause violence, but they're just, they're circular. They tend to be, there's no causation, but there's a lot of correlation. So yeah, I mean, the most vulnerable populations that folks serve are likely going to have experienced some of this, and won't disclose it. So that's the other important thing is, I'll say, this because you worked in family law. Nobody likes to talk about finances, and
mm,
nobody likes to talk about DV. Like, if you ask a person, have you experienced X, Y, and Z? They're not going to willingly tell you, yeah, my finances are a mess, or yeah, I was in an abusive relationship. There's a lot of shame involved in that, that
mm,
people carry. And so it's, people don't self-identify, this is a problem I have. Nobody knew the term coerced. My clients didn't know that term. They didn't know economic abuse. So it was in talking with them that there was this dynamic that I knew the term too, because I would see it as a pattern over and over, and that academics had coined,
mm,
but they wouldn't self-identify. So you have to, like, dig deep and ask questions. And a lot of that has to do, I mentioned this when we were talking another time, is that there was these red flags. Who controls the finances in your household? Do you have access to any of that information? A big red flag was, I was never allowed to check the mail. I was never allowed to access the bank account. Like, he would give me the debit card, I'd use it, and I'd have to give it back to him, or the credit cards. And he said, a lot of times it was coupled with psychological abuse, like, you're too stupid, you don't know anything, you can't handle the finances, I'm going to take care of everything. And then there was another dynamic, because I'm in Texas, and there's a large border region that a lot of women were immigrants, and also they would say, well, you don't know how the US works, you don't even speak our language, so you can't handle anything. And a lot of newer immigrants who are new, US citizens, and have new social securities, have clean history for credit. And so the abuser who had bad credit would use that good credit. It's just, all of this is interrelated.
yeah, it's all so intertwined. And yeah, the communities that are most vulnerable are going to be hit the hardest. So then I'm curious, since I feel like we've established that we're all going to be serving survivors of domestic violence in some capacity, what are some signs? You started there about, I'm not allowed to check the mail, but are there some signs that we can look out for, or what does it look like when we're talking to our clients so we can identify it?
Yeah, I mean, so it depends on how you're serving your client. I always said, if you're a family lawyer, you need to be pulling clients' credit reports, right? Your Equifax, TransUnion, Experian. If you're a consumer lawyer and they're being sued on a debt, you need to pull those reports. If you're helping them, so part of that is because most of if they come in and they say, hey, I can't buy a house, I keep getting denied for a mortgage, or I can't rent, I keep getting denied from rent, or I can't get a job, I keep getting denied for a job, and I'm told it has something to do with my credit, I'm not quite sure. So you pull the reports and oftentimes there are all of these accounts that the survivor had no clue were on their credit record. Didn't know, like I did, like zero clue that I took that out or that was in my name. Or they would say, yeah, that, my ex-husband or my ex-partner forced me to take that out. I never had control of it. Like, he used it, or, auto loans. I don't even have the car anymore. I wasn't allowed to use it. So you kind of discover it by going over those credit histories with them. But a lot of times it is, like I said, those questions of, uh, I'm not sure. I don't know. A lot of times answer questions, I don't know. I'm not sure if even sometimes documentation. Oh, do you have any bills for that? Oh, I don't know. I never had I don't know where they are. Oh, do you have your driver's license or your social? I don't know where they are. My husband, my partner that kept them from me. So a lot of it is like never having access or agency in making financial decisions and having financial documents. Tax related issues come up as well, right? Tax returns. And that's another clear one. I just signed whatever he told me to sign, or she told me to sign, and they told me to sign. I just did whatever they told me to do. So those are a lot of red flags that come up.
That was helpful. And so we've talked a little bit, we've both mentioned, the long-term effects that these type of issues can have on survivors of domestic violence. Can you expand on those long-term effects and how economic abuse, especially coerced debt, can really stick with a survivor long after they're out of the abusive relationship?
Right. So I mentioned the reason I mentioned credit records or credit histories is because everything now uses your credit history. And when I say everything, I mean like any kind of financial transaction, or even, like I said, applying for a job, getting a cell phone, getting a car loan, getting housing, rental housing. They're going to be pulling your credit report. And so if you have damaged credit as a result of coerced debt, because that's debt that you can't pay or shouldn't pay because you didn't know about it, you didn't take it out, that's going to impact your credit score. So the more debt you have, the lower your score, especially if you haven't paid it off. Even if you unfortunately, victims of identity theft and coerced debt, the abusers continuing even after separation to take out more debt or to apply for debt, even if they get denied. So all of those credit inquiries count against your score. If a survivor doesn't freeze their credit, it could be ongoing even after they leave that relationship. The economic abuse, coerced debt can be ongoing. And so all of that is happening. You're getting denied and you can't get the things that you need to survive. So that's like short term. And then medium term or longer term is if you have to, sometimes they take out loans to pay the debt that they shouldn't have to pay, right? So some of those could be payday loans, which have higher interest rates. And so you're paying a higher interest rate to pay credit card debt, to pay the car loan, to pay all of these different things. It can lead to evictions. It can lead to foreclosure and repossession of vehicles for secured property. Sometimes survivors do bankruptcy because they just can't deal with the debt and the debt collection. They can get sued on the debt, get a judgment on the debt. So, those are all like mid to long term, because those then impact your available income. So if you actually are then able to get a job, you're paying a lot of it to pay debt and also trying to survive. So it really, and as we all know, finances impact our well-being. So it also impacts you, emotionally, psychologically, and couple that with the trauma of abuse, of the other forms of abuse you may have experienced. So many of my clients, one of the things that was challenging is that even talking about finances re-triggered the trauma of their other types of abuse. If they had sexual abuse or physical abuse that they experienced, all of that was like intertwined, right? So anytime they would talk about one experience, it would trigger the trauma of the other experiences. That, of course, impacts you physically. We know that we can get sick from that, and also psychologically, emotionally. So sometimes clients, it was so overwhelming, they just would ghost us, right? They're like, I can't deal with this now. It's too much. It's too much. And, it's just eh, walk away, wouldn't hear back from them. And some of them, they're all in different phases of recovery. And so some said, like, yes, I want my day in court. Yes, I want to do lawsuits. Yes, because I need to recover. I want to survive and overcome. I don't want to continue to be a victim. So it really is, kind of lots of different stages, and it does have long-term health, financial, psychological impacts.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that because it answers that age-old question that, I feel like I still get to this day, which is like, why do survivors not leave? And it's for all of these reasons. It's not easy to leave an abusive relationship, especially when there's this economic abuse component to it. And you might not be able to get a place to live after that. And you might have children as well. And as you mentioned, all of the emotional, mental trauma that they've experienced can then impact how they're showing up as a parent. So sometimes, yeah, our clients will ghost us because it's somewhat, in their eyes at the time, easier to stay in the relationship than to kind of face all of that afterwards.
And I mean, and I'll just add in, because what something you just said reminded me, they're clients that have experienced extreme psychological and economic abuse, but maybe not physical violence to the level that would rise to a protective order. And so courts many times don't understand those other components. So when determining if a survivor says, I want to leave this abusive relationship and I have children, but I have no money. And when we're divorced, they're going to consider the best interest of the child. And he has a stable job and he has all of these things. And I have nothing to show, quote unquote, that there's been abuse, and I have no money. So how am I going to be able to get, my situation in order for me to have my children with me? So for the benefit of being with their children, they stay in these abusive relationships.
Yeah, yeah, we've seen it so many times. And later on, I am excited to hear about the one of the wins that you had. But I think we're going to end on a great note hearing that story. Right now, I'm interested in hearing about what laws do we have to address this sort of abuse, because I know, especially when it comes to family law, the domestic violence laws that are out there vary from state to state. So can you tell us a little bit about how we can address economic abuse if we see it?
Yeah, so again, I'm targeting coerced more than anything. There's one state, which is the state of Maine, that actually has a statute with economic abuse as the term, and it has to do with debt collection. And so it's illegal for any creditor, debt collector to collect debt that's as a result of economic abuse in Maine, if they provide supporting documentation. And so the Maine statute talks about what those types of documentation what types of documentation are sufficient. And then there are other states that have passed laws on coerced debt, and the level of protection that a coerced debt victim varies depending on the state. So some of those statutes will make it illegal to collect a debt that's as a result of coerced debt if it's been disputed, if they've been provided supporting documentation, which could be a police report, an FTC identity theft report, a court order, sometimes a letter from a psychologist or a social worker. And then, the creditor or debt collector can do an investigation. And then afterwards, they can't report that debt on the credit report. They can't sue on it. In some statutes, it provides the coerced debt victim a defense to a lawsuit to collect that debt, or a counterclaim. Some of the statutes give you the ability to sue if they continue to collect after you've provided proof that you're a victim of coerced debt. You could get attorney's fees or statutory damages. So they kind of are all over the place depending on what state you are. So the states that I know of as of today that have those laws include Connecticut, Maine, New York, Illinois, California, Texas, Nevada. Hopefully I'm not missing another one, but I might be. And there are several states right now that are in the works, right? They have proposed bills and are, in various processes. And otherwise, so those are all debt collection and like state debt collection laws, which is different than like the federal credit reporting law, which governs how debt is reported and how it appears on credit reports. And so if the coerced debt victim is a victim of identity theft, then they have really strong protections under that federal law as far as what is allowed to appear and not appear on a credit report. If they just are a victim, I hate to say just, but if they are not a victim of identity theft, but on the other hand, the coerced piece, they can
Mhm.
still dispute the debt. The consumer reporting agencies have to investigate it. The furnisher, which is whatever creditor is reporting that debt, has to also investigate it. And that information has to be accurate. So there may be legal claims there that you can assert for however that information is appearing. And then there are also other kind of piecemeal state consumer laws, depending on the type of debt it is. So if it's credit card debt, there are protections under the Federal Truth in Lending Act and the Fair Credit Billing Act. And there, if it's a state, if it's an auto loan, you may have some the ability to get maybe a declaratory judgment that it was forged or it was fraudulent. You may have a defense. So it just depends on that, like each debt has its own law that applies to it. Like mortgages have their own set of laws, right? So there are protections, but all of that to say there are much clearer protections if you fit under the identity theft bucket, and a lot harder if you fit under the coerced debt bucket, unless your state has one of these coerced debt laws.
Okay, so it sounds like, my next question is, looking forward then, what work needs to be done? And I can kind of see from what you just said that maybe there's some state level advocacy that can be done to get fuller protections under the law.
Yeah, I mean, there's also it's creative thinking because sometimes, um, when I was litigating, sometimes I would just bring a declaratory judgment because a declaratory judgment is you're declaring whether or not someone has an obligation under this contract. That was one of the forms that you could bring a deck action. So I said, okay, if there's no other cause of action, let's just bring a deck action and like litigate this out in the court. Does this person owe this debt or not? And that's like important because in family law, if you try to approach it that way, because some states have said, oh, you can get in a divorce decree an order saying this debt was coerced, but the creditor is not a party to that lawsuit. So you can't hold them to that judgment. So again, bringing in that party and saying, hey, if I'm disputing it with you, if I'm calling you about it and you're not doing anything and you're not fixing it, then I'm going to like bring you to court. Of course, that's great if you have a lawyer and if you can afford a lawyer, if you can get a legal aid lawyer. Otherwise, if you're pro se, it's really hard. And so that's why I think there's that policy change that needs to happen. Can we avoid having to go to court? I mean, I'm a lawyer, I love going to court, right? But like for pro se people, can we avoid the process of having to go to court and just get this done outside of court? And that's what those statutes are supposed to do is if we provide you this documentation, can you make a decision that I don't owe this debt, that I am a victim of coerced debt? And in a lot of these statutes, because you're going to hear, well, that's not right. Somebody should be paying on these. Agreed. Let's make the person who took out the coerced debt pay. So they have those provisions of you can sue the alleged perpetrator of coerced debt. So you can still file a suit and collect, just not from the victim.
I'm curious because in family law, a lot of the issues that we have are evidence of domestic violence to then get the remedies. And so you speak of documentation and you listed out some various forms, and it sounds like maybe some states allow different documentations than others. Can you speak a little bit about that and maybe what would be ideal if we're advocating for these type of laws?
Yeah, so the challenge is that the benefit of being in court is that it's all under penalty of perjury. So you're making sure that someone's not like abusing the system and lying. So for that reason, a lot of financial institutions, a lot of folks want the police report that would subject you to, penalty of perjury, or a court order for the same reason. The Federal Trade Commission has on idtheft.gov, they have an identity theft report that is also presumed it's being reported to law enforcement. So it's kind of the same penalty if you lie. But as advocates of survivors, we know that a lot of times survivors have had really negative interactions with law enforcement. So and that's like proven, and that's a whole topic for another day. I promise you could talk about that for a long time. So I had clients that I had to file complaints with the chief of police because they would not take their police report. They just would not believe them. They put them in danger. One particular client, actually the story that we're going to talk about later, to get a police report about identity theft, they said, well, he's your husband. And again, kind of back to this, like, you belong to your husband thing. And so I'm going to call him. She said, but I'm concerned, that this person, I'm at risk for my safety. I don't want you to call my survivor. My abuser. I don't want him to know where I'm at. Well, I'm going to call him anyway, and did call him on the phone. And then also I'm going to pull the video for all the places that these credit cards were used. And if it was you, I'm going to put you in jail. And so all of these things, right, wouldn't take the report, wouldn't, at all. So that happens, and they have this, like, the police don't believe them. And so they have had negative interactions in the past because of DV. So then they don't want to go back. So we wanted to create also forms of self-attestation. Could that be, again, a report by a clergy member, a report by a social services worker, a licensed social services worker? So, there's a state license involved. This person isn't lying. They're not, making it up. Or a healthcare worker, legal service, an attorney, things like that. So there are, we, NCLC created a model law. And so we have a list of proposed documents that could be used, and states can decide which they think would benefit their citizens the most. So.
I love that. And that's a great resource, and it'll definitely be included with the materials that we provide, because that can be helpful. Are there any other resources that maybe we should point our listeners to, or things that they should keep in mind that are coming up?
Yeah, we will put them in the link. There's some resources that the Center for Survivor Agency and Justice has put out, a coerced debt compendium, which talks about how to issue spot for coerced debt, what legal remedies may exist, things like that. But I know we're running short on time, so I think like 3 minutes is the hard stop. So if you want to end with that story, I can just share that story.
We all want to hear the story. So tell us about the successful result you had in that case.
Yeah. So, what I wanted to share was that these clients' lives are messy, and they have so many issues that are related to the DV. So I had a client who came in for help with a divorce. And while we were doing the intake, it came out that the reason she wanted a divorce is, even though the person had been abusive towards her, she'd never gotten a protective order against him. Her oldest daughter made an allegation that he had sexually assaulted her. So that made her realize, like, my daughters aren't safe. We're doing something. So, again, she reported that to law enforcement, had a negative interaction with them, but she told the abuser that, hey, there's a warrant out for your arrest. You have to leave the home. And that wasn't true, but he believed her. And so he left the home, and she was the only one working at the time. The paycheck was going into a joint account that he had sole access to. He was paying the mortgage, but solely from her income. So once he left, he fled to another country. And when he did, and she finally was like, okay, what's going on with my life? I now finally have agency. Discovered that there was about 12 credit cards in his room in a drawer with her name on it. And then, didn't come to us for help with that yet, but she discovered that and was like, I have no idea what to do with this. And then got sued on one of those credit cards and came back. And when she came back, and I was one of the lawyers reviewing her case, started asking her all the questions, turned out like, whoa, we got to pull your credit reports, got to do all this. So we defended her in the lawsuit. Turned out that lawsuit was for a card that she knew about, and she had disputed. When they called her on the phone and they said, hey, we're recognizing that you're making some charges in Cancun. And she's like, I don't have a credit card with you. I'm not in Cancun. I am at work in Indiana. And she said, please close this account. I don't want anybody to use something in my name that's not mine. They said, sorry, we can't close this account unless you pay it off. She's like, I'm not going to pay it off. It's not mine. So he kept lying to her about her rights, didn't close the account, sued her on it. So we filed a counterclaim. They settled that case. She got some money from that case. And then while we were doing all the credit reporting piece and disputing all of that, then we also applied for a declaratory judgment, or it's an order in Texas to declare you a victim of identity theft. Was able to obtain that, to send it out to the creditors. Most of the creditors removed all the debt from the credit report One did not. Actually, two did not. One of them had a judgment against her because she was still with the abuser at the time, and he said, "Just sign this." She didn't speak English, didn't know what she was signing, and it was essentially, "I agree that this is my debt, and I'm going to pay it." So we had to do a bill of review and get that whole opened, and then they dismissed it, and then they removed it from her credit report. But after I represented her for 5 years, and after 5 years, we had to file suit against the credit reporting companies, the Experian, TransUnion, Equifax, as well as the creditor who kept saying, "Well, this is your account because it has your phone number on, I'm sorry, it has your address on it. It's your date of birth. It's your name. And it's being paid out of the same bank account with your name on it." So again, this was the abuser who had opened out that credit account without her knowledge or permission, using the joint account she never had access to pay that credit card. And it had all of the information because they lived together, but it had a different phone number and a different email, one that was belonging to him. So, we were saying, well, you didn't investigate it, because if you had read her dispute, she was saying, yes, all of this is going to be mine because he did it in my name. So after 5 years, we got her six-figure settlement and were able to get her to pay off her car loan and to pay a significant amount of her mortgage. She had issues with her mortgage because he was on it and he fled the country, and we couldn't get it modified without his permission. Had to do advocacy with HUD. So just, this is a story of all of this messiness as a result of the economic abuse. It ended with a good story, but it required kind of digging in the trenches. So don't shy away, because the great end is that she got a lot of money. We got our attorney's fees, and we were able to help her move on with her life. The success story that we had with that client, we were able to have because she did meet the traditional definition of identity theft, but she actually had several other accounts that were coerced, and we couldn't address any of those. Those remain on her credit report. So we wanted to address some of that, and the National Consumer Law Center, in partnership with the Center for Survivor Agency and Justice, actually filed a petition with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, asking them to do a rulemaking to expand the definition of identity theft under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, so that all coerced debt victims could actually request a block, so request that information from not appearing on their credit report if it was as a result of coerced debt. So we filed that petition last year. And then in January of 2024, the CFPB granted that petition. And so they sent out an advance notice of proposed rulemaking, asking people to comment and on whether or not the Bureau should do this, and whether coerced debt should be, identity theft should be expanded to reflect all victims of coerced debt, how coerced debt impacts people, including other populations like communities of color, older Americans, foster youth. So they wanted to hear from everybody about that. So that's something that's really exciting. There's been a change in administration. There's been, some reductions in force at the administration, at the CFPB. So we're not sure where that's going to go, but that's something that would really help survivors if it were to come into fruition, to actually some regulations surrounding coerced debt.
And so is there anything we can do with, if it does happen to move forward, what would be the next steps in that process? And then how can we all engage with it?
Yeah, so because it's a basically open rulemaking, it's all public. Anyone is allowed to comment on it. So, if you have and you represent clients who have experienced coerced debt, filing a comment saying, yes, we think this is a good idea and here's why. Or if their proposed rule is not good, even in those circumstances, right? If they say, we're going to only accept a police report, and you think they should accept other types of documentation, it's important to get your voice out there and say why. The rules and the regulations reflect the comments of everybody. So even survivors themselves have commented and said, this would help me. I really think you all should do this. So, to the extent that a rulemaking comes out, your support would be invaluable. And I think another area is if you're involved in state policy at all, and there are groups that are working on helping address this dynamic at the state level, and would love help y'all in any way that you're working on these issues. And if you're representing clients and you have questions, we would love to talk to you about that. So the more folks that are helping out survivors, the better.
Yeah, I certainly agree. And we'll leave links to all of that in the resources so you'll be able to reach out to your organization who's doing amazing work. Well, thank you for sharing that with us, Carla. I'm wondering, is there anything you would want people who represent survivors of domestic abuse and who clients who experience economic abuse specifically, anything that you would want them to know?
Yeah, so anyone who's ever worked in domestic violence knows about something called safety planning, which is you tell someone how to make sure that they aren't in a position where they're more likely to experience violence or put themselves in a risky situation. And the same is true with economic or financial abuse. There's like safety planning for financial abuse or for economic abuse. And those things include like when at the point that it's safe and they've been separated from their abuser, ask them, is it safe to change your passwords? Is it safe to close accounts? Like for example, a bank account, to safe to close that one and open a new one that the abuser doesn't have access to, doesn't have information about. Security freezes, I talked about that a little bit. So on your credit reports, you can put security freezes, which means nobody new can take out credit in your name without you knowing, because there's a freeze on that report. And the only way to do that is you have to lift the freeze. You have to get a pin that only you have, that you can use to unfreeze that report. Online safety, right? Changing passwords and accounts, things even like Netflix, Amazon, anything, on your phone, passwords on your phone, apps, a lot of ways, especially with physical safety, of if they can see what apps you're accessing and what you're purchasing, they may be able to know where you are located physically. So you want to protect not only your financial safety, but your physical safety, because a lot of times those purchases will divulge that information. So a lot of those things that people don't think about, right? You don't automatically think, when I leave an abusive situation, I need to go change all of my passwords. I need to change my account numbers. I need to close accounts, right? So you can cancel credit cards and open a new, request a new card. So just new card information, even though the account number is the same. Changing even security questions on those. If they have access, if they were an authorized user, remove the abuser as an authorized user if it's safe to do so, and there won't be physical retaliation. Changing addresses, changing all of those things. So yes, that's one thing I wish that advocates of survivors knew about.
And Carla, having worked with you for a number of years, I feel ashamed to even say that I'm kind of learning some of this stuff for the first time, because yeah, when I'm safety planning with a client, I'm seeing now that I've fallen into the trap of a lot of my safety planning was for physical abuse. But yeah, I don't recall that I would ask questions about changing passwords after and all of that, which makes complete sense. And getting new cards and new cards information. So that's so important. And hopefully it's something that people can add to their safety planning discussion that they have with clients. Amazing, Carla. I just have to thank you for all of your advocacy in this area. You're so inspiring. And thank you for having such an engaging and thought-provoking discussion today. Your insights not only deepened our understanding of coerced and economic abuse, but also reminded us that addressing domestic violence is central to the fight for civil rights and social justice. So thank you all for joining us for this chair chat in recognition of Domestic Violence Awareness Month. I encourage you to stay engaged with the ABA's Civil Rights and Social Justice section, visit their website, explore upcoming events, and consider joining one of their committees. I also invite you to learn more about the work of the ABA Commission on Domestic and Sexual Violence, where we provide training, resources, and support to strengthen the legal community's response to survivors. Once again, thank you to Carla, our wonderful team behind the scenes, and of course, all of you for making time to be here today. We look forward to seeing you at the next chair chat and continuing this vital work together. Thank you.